fire philosophy, Nietzsche, Zen, and how to live.
Welcome, fire philosophers, to this really special conversation. It's special for me, especially because we have with us an old flame of mine. By which I mean this was Professor Grant Farrad was my professor when I think I was mere 20-year-old at Williams College taking a class called, goodness, it was about Toni Morrison and Richard Wright. I don't know what the title was. Do you remember the full title?
Yeah, it was right to Morrison.
Right to Morrison. That's right. I thought there was a colon. There's probably you probably inserted a colon in there somewhere as or is it just right to Morrison? Anyhow, he made me read all of Richard Wright's novels and all of Toni Morrison's novels, and I was a good obedient student, and I actually read them all. And for my endeavor, I got a solid B plus. And there I was, minding my own business all these years later, starting to read, think about freedom. So I picked up this book, Freedom, a Disease Without a Cure by Zizek. And in the preface, he speaks about Professor Farad's book, how Heidegger or Martin Heidegger saved my life. So I immediately hop, skipped, and jumped and read that and thought it was a really fascinating description of his encounter while raking leaves at Ithaca, which I'll turn over to. That does it no justice, right? But I'll let you speak on behalf of that. So, Professor Farad, would you like to give us a little bit more background about yourself, your whatever you'd like our listeners to know about you?
I'm happy to skip the background. I'd much rather just get to the questions. You know, it's sort of, I think one of the remarkable strengths of Slavoj Žižek is the capaciousness of his reading. I know Žižek is often taken to task by a number of people, most of whom I suspect have not read him, but they dismiss him as flippant and superficial and overproductive, I think. And in that critique, I think is not only a certain tendency to not engage, but a certain, I don't know, sort of baseline jealousy. How does Slavoj write this much? And I find that quite remarkable. But I should say that I gave Mr. Pierkarski, now Professor Pierkarski, which will tell you that I have aged and he has grown up and acquired a library full of books and an expensive bicycle by all accounts, and also managed to find himself an eminent mentor in Professor Wright. So by all accounts, it's Mr. Pierkarski, who's Professor Pierkarski, who's come out all right, while I struggle manfully to deal with students who will not do what Mr. Pierkarski did, which is read a novel every week. And this will please you, I hope, Mr. Pierkarski. I have given in my entire career 9 A's. So a B plus is a very solid grade. In fact, and that's not a joke.
Right.
I've been teaching since 95 and I've given 9 A's. I've been at the institution that now employs me and I've given one undergraduate A in the course of 17 years. So very few B pluses. It was a
Oh, yeah.
remarkable thing about being a teacher at Williams College. It was the apogee of my pedagogical career, and I'm not joking about this because you could actually get students to read. And I have a new project coming out, and it's called A Sports Odyssey, my Ithaca Journal, and I talk about the remarkable students whom I taught at Williams College. So, um,
Yeah. Well,
yeah, so it was.
it was a little tongue in cheek when I called you my own flame, but not really. And that's because to get to the questions, it's hard to look back on one's life in hindsight, I suppose, and figure out what's memory and what's reconstruction. But I'm pretty sure that your class was the first class in which I thought about race for the first time in a sophisticated way. And so you lit a flame of a certain kind under my ass because, you taught me you helped me take those initial steps. And then in my own career, after I graduated college, you don't know this, but I did teach for America, and I taught in a probably one of the worst performing schools in the country in Jersey City, right across from the World Trade Center. My teaching career started on September 5th, 2001, half a mile from the World Trade. So all of the stuff about race inequality and, I mean, it literally blew up outside my teacher's window. So anyway, you were really instrumental in helping me with those initial framings. So I thought we could start there, sort of
Sure.
at you're requesting at the in the heart of the beast. In this book, Martin Heidegger Saved My Life. You write you write one daring sentence. Well, you write many daring
Only
sentences.
one?
You write many daring sentences, and this is the sort of the summary. You wrote one moment you're raking leaves, the next you're thanking Heidegger. Can you give our readers who have not read this book, can you tell us what that means? What happened?
My son, who's 16, as I said, is a frequent thorn in my flesh. A rather annoying kid, but, I guess that's his job, right? But he remarks acerbically, Dad, he says two things. One of them involves Martin Heidegger, well, both of them, but he says, Dad, if you love Heidegger so much, why don't you marry him? And the second one is all you think about, Dad, is thinking, and he's not wrong. But I will get to the Heidegger in just a second. I want to talk about that very kind, I don't know, I suppose, pedagogical compliment you paid me. I said this to my students yesterday. We never know how pedagogy works out. All pedagogy is a wager on the future. We give our students a set, we hope, of questions that will live with them for the rest of their lives. And we never know when those questions will fully come into bloom, how they will germinate, whether they will or whether they won't germinate. And you're one of many Williams students whom I know of who did this quite honorable thing called Teach for America, which is deeply problematic, of course, because the US school system is so messed up that they, have these bright young things fresh out of liberal arts colleges, especially going to the worst possible schools. And I've had former students of mine go to Mississippi, Louisiana. One of them even, ventured into the belly of the beast, which is the New York City public school system. So what you did there, I imagine, I'm not sure that I can take any credit for, except to say that that was one of the wagers I made. I mean, I can remember exactly where you sat, and because I'm fairly sort of stentorian and inflexible about these things, I have my students sit in the same place, so just I know where they are. But to have done that seems to me to already have begun the work of, imagining how to be in the world for yourself. In other words, you come out of this privileged little ivy and you decide you want to do something. And next thing I know, you're at the University of Texas at Austin, which is no small accomplishment. So how did I get there? One moment I'm raking leaves, the next I'm thanking Martin Heidegger. Heidegger says, Danke ist, denken ist Danke. To think is to thank. And the contradiction for me, of course, if one were to phrase that generously, because you could say it's just a brutal historical irony, given the fact that Martin Heidegger was, at least a fellow traveler with National Socialism, potentially and very likely worse. And there are only two mentions of a Black person in Heidegger, and neither of them are very complimentary. So here I am, this historically disenfranchised Black South African, raking leaves one moment, and the next, as you say, I'm thanking Heidegger. How does one arrive at such a point? Well, it's a circuitous journey. But the most important aspect of that journey is that it it involved a certain capaciousness of appetite, and even more important than that, an openness to what I didn't know. It seems to me that the remarkable thing about being a teacher is that one has the opportunity to expose one's students not only to what they don't know, but what the teacher does not know. And I arrived at Heidegger via a really strange trajectory. Not only having, emerged from apartheid South Africa, but my entire project as a scholar in graduate school was turned on the work of intellectuals. My dissertation, which became, I think, my second or third monograph, is called What's My Name? And the opening chapter there is Muhammad Ali, and the closing chapter is Robert Nesta Marley, right? In between, sandwiched, is C.L.R. James and Stuart Hall more recognizably. They're more recognizable as intellectuals. And so the book came out in around 2003. I was then teaching in the program in literature at Duke University. I was surrounded by a remarkable array of minds, most notably Frederick Jameson, Valentine Mudumbi, Barbara Herrnstein-Smith, Taro Moy. Among the young guns there in our senior faculty was Michael Hart, but there was also the venerable presence of Ken Sohan, who was, with whom I've been friends for over 30 years. So I recognized that once that book came out and I was surrounded by these people, what was truly astounding about the likes of Fred, Michael, Taro, Valentine, Barbara, was that these were folks who did their work without ever talking about it. I don't mean they weren't intellectually engaged. I mean, they were never self-advertising. They never said, "Oh, I've got this book coming out. You have to read this." And I always think of myself as a water boy in that department. It wasn't Duke so much, it was the program in literature. And here I was getting a second shot at grad school, and they were paying me a decent salary. But having written What's My Name, I realized that I had, forgive this as a poor phrasing, but I'd written myself into a corner. And if I were to continue to produce the kind of work that had allowed me to write What's My Name, I could make a decent career. I could maybe study a different set of figures and so on and so forth. But I would have done nothing. But what I realized in retrospect is that having written myself into a corner, I was now free to liberate myself from that corner. But I was free to do so with this set of dispositifs, as Foucault would say, or apparatuses, which is to say, an entirely new archive became accessible to me. And key to that was, Fred's work, Valentine, Barbara's, Taro's, Ken's. So I was able to think, I was given the opportunity to think in a very different way. But the most important thing I was given was an opportunity to think about thinking. I didn't know this. And unlike most people who come to Jacques Derrida through Heidegger, if one follows a formal philosophical training, I did this in reverse. I'd begun to read Derrida and work on him a little for my dissertation. But after 2003, I, sort of engaged much more fully. And Heidegger kept coming up, and I thought, okay, time to bite the bullet. So I read Was heißt denken, it says, it is not that we think too much and act too little, but that we act too much and think too little. And as somebody who had grown up, and clearly the trajectory of my career, cultural studies / post-colonial theory, would have made me an alien to that concept. Because you grew up in apartheid South Africa, you have to do something. But Heidegger, he pulled me up short with that. And so I began to engage that. And I can't tell you how many copies of Was heißt denken I have, and I've gone through them and written them up, marginalia all over the place. And one of the key lines there is, denken is danke, to think is to thank. But as I said, everything in my upbringing, every political instinct I have, every intellectual inclination should have turned me away from Heidegger, but it didn't. Because I realized that in positing, presenting, arguing for the likes of Muhammad Ali and Bob Marley as intellectuals, and arguing that the key moment in C.L.'s life is not his study of Toussaint L'Ouverture and the Haitian Revolution, otherwise known as the Black Jacobins, but it was in fact this moment in Beyond the Boundary when James says, cricket had plunged me into politics long before I was aware of it. When I did turn to politics, I did not have too much to learn. That's, you know, an extract from James I have turned over again and again. I used Gramsci to get to James, and instead of James's Gramsci's two categories, traditional and organic intellectuals, I posited a third category called the vernacular. So, in truth, the only question I'd ever been preoccupied with and have been preoccupied with, and am now at least able to confront as that question, is what does it mean to think what he's thinking? That's why I was so drawn to intellectuals. That's what motivated my project on positing Ali and Marley as intellectuals, vernacular intellectual, as I said. So, recognizing that, Heidegger was the only place to go. And it's one of those moments that was just thrown up before me. Here I am, as I said, raking leaves. And there's a really unpleasant incident, or what should have been an unpleasant incident. And I suspect this is what you're asking me to describe. But it's Guy Fawkes Day, the 5th of November, 2013. I'm on sabbatical. I've just gone to the office, done what I'm supposed to do, had a meeting with a student. I've taken off, as you know, Mr. Pierkowski, my customary, teaching attire, which is I wear a tie and a jacket because only the ruling class can afford to dress down. That's my rationalization, and I'm sticking to it. And there I am raking leaves, a couple of hours later. And a white couple. I live in a neighborhood that is almost exclusively white, as my son and I like to joke. We're the only black people on the street, probably in the neighborhood. That's not even a joke. Volvo pulls up because we live at the corner, at a juncture, two roads. I'm raking, the one drives past me, goes to the stop sign, backs up, and I know what's coming. She says, and I quote, "Do you want another job?" And without missing a rhetorical beat, I say, and I'm very, very proud of this response, maybe, savvy, but just it's all due to Heidegger. That's why I thank Heidegger. I say, I could have sworn, I could have said, F you, white lady, But I say, only if you can match my Cornell faculty salary. And there's really no riposte this white woman can provide because she has been called up short, right? She's completely misrecognized me. And I think you and I have, in broad terms, spoken about this, Mr. Pierkowski. Yes, I didn't use the F word, and you've pushed me on this a little. You said, so why? Because I do say I had another option, right? Not only the expletive, but I argue later on in this extended essay, the Heidegger Project, I say, Malcolm X poses the question. He says, what do you call an N with a PhD? And the answer is, of course, in the question. It's an N, yes? But I don't turn to that. There's no Fanonian impulse. There's no expletive. In other words, I could have gone all Miles Davis on her and said mofo. I didn't. I turned to Heidegger because that moment is the culmination of a decade at least, but probably more like a dozen years of engagement with Heidegger, where I'm able to say and to phrase this so precisely, that's the conditional clause, only if you can match my Cornell faculty salary. And the key word there, you might want to say is Cornell, but it isn't. I would argue it's faculty. And the second most important term is the conditional only. How does one, in a moment of being under racial attack, under racist attack, formulate such a response? My answer is Martin Heidegger and my engagement with him. Hence, Denken is Duncan. I must thank Heidegger for what he made possible. And so I know your larger project, and I'll let you, I'm sorry, I'm going on for a while, but you asked me, how does one, if what drives you, Professor Spirkowski and Wright, if what drives your project is how to be in the world, and you say stay away from abstraction, I am probably the worst guest you can possibly have. Because it's only through abstraction, engagement, and giving myself over to thinking that I'm able to, in that moment, formulate so precise, and I like to think acerbic, but also stinging response. Only if you can match my Cornell faculty salary. That silences the woman. She drives off. I don't know if she's still alive, and quite frankly, I don't care. But I do know that she had, in that moment, met her match, and she had no idea that the reason for my formulation in its precision is derived from a German Nazi.
So let me ask you more about the qualities of thinking that you found so transformative. So we all know from having read some Heidegger that thinking is not, in Heidegger's terms, not what we ordinarily do, right? She wasn't thinking. Most of us are not thinking. You probably weren't thinking when you were raking leaves. There were cognitive things happening, right? Lots of objects were there and you were doing something, getting something done, and so on. But so what is it about thinking that Heidegger brings to light that's so transformative, that's so distinct?
I'm going to answer with all due regard, Professor Wright, again in an entirely abstract way. After I read Was heißt Denken, after I reread Was heißt Denken,
Can I quickly translate for everybody that the title in English is
What is called thinking?
What is called
Yeah.
thinking? Yep.
What is called thinking? Yeah. I find myself, Professor Wright, after having engaged, after having read this book, but from the very first moment that I read that, after that I am duty bound. I am called by Heidegger to never not think. And Heidegger, as you know better than I do, is completely imprecise about what thinking is, because he can only define it through negation. He says, and I'm quoting here, we do not know what thinking is, but we know when we are not thinking. What a remarkable call to arms that is. What an injunction, what an exhortation. Yes?
Yeah.
We do not know when we are thinking. So I'm not sure when I'm thinking, but I always have to guard against not thinking, which means that as a teacher, I have to be thinking. As somebody who is trying to write, as I do frequently on an almost daily basis, I have to be thinking about whether or not I'm thinking. Hence my son's joke, you're always thinking about thinking. And my response, though I will not indulge him in this, is a question again. Yes, what else is there to do? Or, in more explicitly philosophical terms, if I'm not thinking, how am I in the world? It doesn't mean one forgoes pleasure, or it's not the wearing of a hair shirt. It is an acute attempt to be, one, open to the world, two, to be considering one's effect, the effect of one's being in the world. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, is just how am I to be in this world? Not only in relation to Heidegger and his work and my thinking, but to the other. So you tell the story, Mr. Pierkowski, of looking out from Jersey City and seeing the towers under attack and crumble. My question is, how prepared were you to deal with that moment? That's the first question. The second is, how had your very expensive Williams College education prepared you to be in the world for what is truly an event? That is, the event is that which changes the way we are in the world fundamentally. And so, Professor Wright, if we are going to be in the world as unthinking beings, what that entails is our lack of preparedness for how to respond adequately to that moment. There is no guarantee that we respond adequately or that we can command a sufficient vocabulary for then Mr. Pierkarski, now Professor Pierkarski, to have responded to his students and said, this is an event. And perhaps to begin by saying, I cannot and maybe will never be able to fully comprehend that moment. But I do know that that moment calls me to think about my being in the world.
Mm.
Less than 2 decades later, there will be a pandemic. And what I espied in all those, because apparently I only teach in privileged institutions, but I went from Williams to Duke to where I am now. And what I saw were students in the pandemic unable to frame that question, to ask of themselves, how am I to be in the world in a moment when things have radically shifted? So, what does Heidegger give me? What does that mean? What is my transformation? And it could very well be something on the order of, falling off a horse. Don't call me St. Paul. But I have no letters of which to speak. The Ephesians will have to wait. But that moment opens up something. It makes something possible that was not possible before. A keenness and attentiveness to how one is in the world, and an acknowledgement that one can never be fully prepared for the event. That is the nature of the event, is that it catches you completely by surprise. And yet, everything in how you have been toward the other, how you have been in the world, requires you to be, in some ways, a follower of Lord Baden-Powell. In other words, the man who founded the Boy Scouts in India. You have to prepare for that moment. You have to prepare for a moment for which you cannot prepare. And that's a singular and demanding task. But in order to be in the world, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's the current crisis that this country finds itself in, the question is always, how am I to be in this world? The second question is, how am I to be in relation to the other? And then as teachers, we know we have to take seriously this pedagogical responsibility. Our work is not to affirm our students. Our task, the responsibility imposed upon us, is that we have to allow them to come into thinking. We have to help them to come into thinking. We have to continue to think about thinking by ourselves. And most importantly, we have to ask them this question again and again. How are you to be in the world? And I would have to say I find it increasingly difficult within US institutions of higher learning to make that question reverberate within the walls of academia. That seems to me a problem, because if we didn't learn from the pandemic, when conditions were so dire, when there was such massive inequality, Professor Pierkarski says, this was the first time, 1999, when I was made to think about race. That's a problem. I'm happy to have been able to do that, but it seems to me that moment should have occurred a long time ago. In some kind of formal sense, there should have been some training. And that I was able to do that is of some solace and consolation, but is also profoundly disturbing, because I would ask, why in the wake of this, international global catastrophe, we have not instituted in every, college and university in this country a course which asks us to confront exactly that question.
Professor Farad, it's so delightful to have the author of a book, to explain himself. It's a privilege. And I have a particular phrase you wrote that it's not that I disagree with it or agree with it, but it really landed with me, and I'm hoping you could say a little more about it. It's when you write, Heidegger demands that thinking begin with thinking. That is where his felicity lies. Not so with Du Bois and Fanon, not so with Malcolm X and Morrison. Their first loyalty, understandably, is to race. And then you write, I think a little bit later, you say thinking demands fidelity to thinking and thinking only. And the last little bit, you say contamination is a force for thinking, not an impediment. I'm trying to think non-dualistically, and maybe this is where you're going with this. But when I, for example, think of beloved, obviously it's, well, obviously, maybe nothing's obvious, but I would say, sure, front and center is race and slavery and historical consciousness about that. But I would also, of course, say that, my God, what a brilliant, intelligent book that's obviously written in from a thinking person's spirit. But for you to say something like that, her allegiance is obviously to race, whereas Heidegger's is to thinking, is that a is in that somehow maybe in this encounter you privileged, I don't know if that's the right word, given that's a loaded term too. I wonder, is it a contradiction?
Let me see if I can help you, Professor Spirkowski. I think what you're saying to me is that seems wrong. I think, in a word, I don't think you quite want to go there, but that's what to use Heidegger's term, that's what I intuit, you know, because, and I have
Or
to tell
ironic,
you,
as you say, right? Or maybe ironic, if anything, or unexpected, or somehow, yeah.
no, I think the force of your unarticulated critique bears thinking. I will also tell you that as far as I have experienced the response to this text, and it's largely broken up into two camps, and they're disciplinary, if by disciplinary we mean a mode of engaging or trying to construct an epistemology. And I think I think the camps are equally divided, thank goodness. But the camp, I think that, and unfairly locating you, so apologies in advance. I presented on this pamphlet, extended essay, Martin Heidegger Saved My Life, at my current home institution. And I work in an Africana Studies department, which, is about diasporic Black life. Striking that at this event, this reading, not a single one of my colleagues, all of whom are diasporic, all of whom are Black, asked the question. But they all offered critiques in the hallways the next day, of course. And they said, why didn't you use James Baldwin? Another one said, I was going to ask a question, which is always, no, you didn't really want to ask a question. You can see where this is going. One, they're completely unsettled by this Black man, me, diasporized. And if one is going to play the game that is identity politics, I'm pretty well situated to come. I'm going to meddle. Let me put it this way. I'm Black, disenfranchised, grew up under apartheid, segregated education, the whole. But that's going to win me, maybe a bronze medal at least. And so my fealty is expected to be to race. That's what I'm supposed to be loyal to. Yes? Who's to say I'm not? That's a different kind of question. But the expectation is that I would have turned to those thinkers who are identifiable within a canon that, shall we say, is the Black intellectual tradition, among whom these days, the most canonized is certainly Frantz Fanon. Yes. Look, a Black man, make of me a human at the end. Professor Birkowski, how can I put this? And there's no gentle, delicate way to put this, but
Lay it on me.
the disciples are always a lot less interesting than the master. Fanon should not be left to the Fanonians. They do him no service. because we use Fanon as we are prone, as if he were an Old Testament prophet. We use him as a blunt instrument. It is how we read Baldwin, and we do not distinguish between Baldwin's essays, which are a remarkable contribution to American letters. Baldwin's novels, on the other hand, they're a rough read, full of turgid prose. Yes? Baldwin is an excellent essayist, certainly following a long tradition, going back, as you know, Emerson and Thoreau. Yes? Morrison, as you point out, is a truly remarkable thinker on race. But Morrison's strength, I would argue, derives from the ways in which it is never an explicit object. The thing as such is never the thing as such. Thus, Morrison is, a remarkable master or exponent of what's that thing called the opening line? 124 Bluestone Road was haunted. They shoot the white girl first. That's the opening line of Paradise. Come on, man. That's you can hang a hat on that. You can make a career on that. But Morrison, for all his strength, Baldwin, for all his expertise and brilliance as an essayist, Fanon, for all his call to arms, is not sufficient. But for that, by that same logic, so is Derrida, so is Deleuze. Why? Because not a one of them, and you can add a whole plethora of folks, not one of them ask this question. How am I to think about thinking? That's the only question that is of concern to me. That's my narrowness. That's the question that it's the thread that runs through my entire herb that is my work. It's like, but that's the only question I'm ever trying to answer. Here's the other camp. I grew up disenfranchised in South Africa, but I was educated, at least at high school, by Trotskyists. In other words, everything in my training is about capaciousness, is about a determination to break with orthodoxy. One of my most recent projects is called The Perversity of Gratitude in Apartheid Education. And this is my sort of attempt at, light Morrison light. The opening line to that book is, apartheid made me think. In other words, I refuse to be circumscribed in my canons. My archive will lead me where it leads me. I will never, by virtue of how I am in the world, how I am recognized in the world, how I have come to be in the world, be able to slough off race. And that's not something I want to do. But I am also committed to thinking about thinking on a daily basis, on a moment-by-moment basis. And I am completely unapologetic about who gets me there. The most important book in my herb is Was heißt denken. Now, everything's wrong about that. And yes, I may very well be just a damn perverse soul, but look what it opened up. And this is the other part of that being in that second camp. Because that book fundamentally changed how folks understand my work. My editor at the University of Minnesota Press, Doug Armato, said this very kind thing to me. He said, because, Martin Heidegger Saved My Life is part of the Forerunner series with the University of Minnesota Press. And Doug said, that book changed the entire understanding of the series. That's a very kind thing to say. I doubt it's entirely true, but I'm taking it. Right. But that book, as importantly for me, opened my work to a series of constituencies who would never previously, I think, have wanted to engage that question. And I am surprised because just 2 weeks ago, a friend said to me, I was talking to somebody and they're reading Was heißt denken? Martin Heidegger Saved My Life. I can't tell you, what it feels like to think about thinking all the time, to be completely consumed by that question. Professor Wright called it transformative. I think it's now something that's almost recognizably ontological for me. It's not Morrison or Heidegger. It's much more likely to be Morrison through Heidegger or Heidegger and Baldwin. Right? Because I think Heidegger thinks about thinking, and if you read enough philosophy, you read Deleuze, you read Derrida, you read Zizek, you read Kant or Hegel, they're thinking about thinking. They occasionally turn to the question. But Heidegger is the first philosopher after Descartes to take thinking seriously. It's the only question, together with being for him. And I would argue you cannot be in the world without thinking. And you cannot think without thinking for being. So I don't have to make a choice between Morrison or Baldwin on the one hand and Heidegger on the other. There is too little time to do work to be insisting on those distinctions. I have experienced discrimination and circumscription enough in my life to stand steadfastly and militantly against it for the rest of my life. I am not the sum total of my disciplinary appointment. I am, as far as possible, committed to asking, what does it mean to think? And you know this, I said this now for 30 years as a teacher. There is no thinking except in the writing. There is no writing except in the rewriting. I've condensed that into a phrase, and I say to my students now, only writing can bear truth. In other words, every word you use has to be carefully turned. There is a precision. Only writing can bear truth. My debt to Heidegger is unpayable, as it should be. The irony and the paradox of my relationship to him, that I think opens me to all kinds of critiques. But I'm okay with that. I get to think.
I have a question that I hope could actually involve the both of you because we have a Zen scholar with us and Professor Wright. I don't know if this is a good question, so I'll just toss it out and maybe Dale, you could adjudicate. But with all this talk about thinking, I recall Dogen is the founder of Zen in Japan. His sort of, I call it definition or instructions to students about what meditation is. And I think I don't know if it's famously said, but said, like when the student asks, what should I do? Dogen replied, think, not thinking. And I wonder, is is this the way Professor Farad is talking about thinking as a substrate to his life? Is that, Dale, do you think what Dogen was talking about in Zen? Maybe I should just let you translate how you interpret Dogen's statement and whether we're talking about the same thing or completely different things.
Yeah. Well, I think there's definitely an interesting relationship, but debate over what Dogen meant by these cryptic remarks, more cryptic even than Heidegger, I'm afraid, has gone on for over a millennium. But I think the connection is that where Heidegger talks about calculative thinking, right, Professor Farid, and methodical thinking, and thinking that already knows what it's after, right, where there's a goal, you've got it, you're going to work your way towards it. That thinking is for Dogen a failure of thinking. Mm-hmm. And so he's like for Heidegger, he's saying you've got to get out of that sense of knowingness, where you know what you're after, and you've got to attain some state. And in Zen meditation, this is what you're doing for months and years, attaining that state of openness so that you clear away all of your stuff that's projecting and able to actually hear what the world is saying to you, what's coming into you, what you can take that's not just you putting it out. So I think there's a great connection there. So Beth, let me just ask, how would I be doing from your point of view, Professor Farid, if I were to say, oh, okay, or could I translate was heißt denken, what's called thinking, into was heißt imagination? Would imagination be an appropriate stand-in for what Heidegger thinks by thinking? Or is there a limit to that, the point at which it doesn't go very far?
Yeah. I don't know. I think we could propose a meeting of the minds between Heidegger and Fred Jameson, the late Frederick Jameson, because I think Jameson, in the last decade of his life, and certainly before that, his critiques of science fiction, and he's turned towards, pardon, the utopian, which takes place already by the time, Fred turns 70. But the utopian is searching for a different way to be in the world. And I don't know Dogen, but I do know that my favorite place in the world is Japan. Because when I'm there, I've only been there once, and it is utterly just mind-blowing for me. Firstly, it's one of those places in the world, and people say it's like England or the British system, but it isn't, because there's a different set of imperatives at work. When you're in Japan, the education system at the tertiary level operates in a very un-American way. Private institutions carry very little intellectual weight, whereas public institutions are highly valued. The logic is that anybody can buy their way into a private institution, but you have to test your way into a public institution. And I had the opportunity to present and work with colleagues at two institutions. And when I was at Hitotsubashi, I mean, I was Joe Satriani. I was surfing with the aliens, because there were probably about somewhere between 18 and 30 people in a room. I was being asked a question in English, which was then being translated by a Bulgarian into Japanese, and the answer would come back to me. And I thought to myself, Jesus Christ, what's just happened here? But I've never been so fully engaged, or should I say, absolutely exhausted after 3 hours as I was at Hitotsubashi. I also know that I've probably not released as many endorphins as I did when I was there, because the utter intensity of that experience was just remarkable for me. And I suspect that there's a stringent Japanese in me, because I love their punctuality, I love the cleanliness of the society, and I love the utter innerness, if there is such a term, of Japanese society. Because you can be on a Tokyo street with thousands of other people, maybe even tens of thousands at a railway station, and you can be utterly with yourself. It's a remarkable thing. I feel completely at home in Japan. I did when I was there. So I can understand, why 1945 happens, right? It makes sense, because there's a kind of fealty to something in Japan that is very powerful, destructive as well. But I wonder if I might not throw this back at you, Professor Wright, and say that there's a reason Heidegger gets to thinking in Was heißt denken through Hölderlin, and not as his primary interlocutor, as das Ding an sich, rather than Hegel or Kant or anybody else, or Descartes even, would seem to be the most obvious point of philosophical entree. Heidegger refuses that. And so I think, on the one hand, there's absolute affirmation of your question. And here's where the Jamesonian comes in, right? Jameson says the utopian is imagining a different way to be in the world while taking cognizance of where we are and working with those institutions in order to undo them. That's the remarkable political project that Jameson proposes. But Heidegger, I think, and I use that loosely here, but what he wants from us is thinking as an openness toward the world. And that's why it's Hölderlin, because the answers are, as you say, not calculative or prescriptive or preordained. They're unknowable in advance. And that's the remarkable thing for me about Was heißt denken. To not know what thinking is, But there's also the stringency and the discipline. And Heidegger, as we know, and you know better than I do, Professor Roy, was really drawn to Japanese society. And its most sort of unforgiving Zen disciples. Those are the people who interested him in him, because there is a certain kind of martial discipline about that, about thinking. But discipline is not just about forswearing what it is you can do, but understanding what that forswearing makes possible. It's Socrates in the Phaedrus, right? At the end of his life, or talking to this ambitious young Greek man who's hoping to seduce Socrates. And Socrates, he says, you want to become an important member of the Senate. What have you learned? What have you done? He says, look at what the Persians do. They have people who are experts in mathematics and logic and so on. Look at what the Spartans do. They discipline their bodies. What are you doing as an Athenian? Discipline as a form of making possible, as a way of pairing, doing away with the extraneous, and as a way of settling into being without settling, without compromising, without, the usual kind of indulgences. It is something I think fundamentally different. How can I prepare myself to be open to the world, knowing full well that my openness will only always be partial, but then, as it were, working on that and working with that openness. So I think when Heidegger talks about intuition, it's in a distinctly and almost aggressively non-scientific, non-calculative register. It is about not knowing. And I think not knowing is not just the embrace of ignorance, but it is a preparedness. It begins from the preparedness that is, I don't know. So what can I make possible? What can I open myself up to? And the marvelous thing about that is, like, you don't know.
And one of my favorite Zen zingers that I return to all the time is not knowing is most intimate.
Yeah. And I mean, it's difficult to tell your students that because they measure themselves by these extant metrics. What is my grade? It's never what have I learned? That's never the question. How can what I don't know serve as a spur, to use Derrida, to open up something else? And I wonder if, we haven't, as a profession, lost the joy of not knowing. and and we're so called upon to be experts all the time, and we're so interested in being, God knows what's this ugly term, a public intellectual. I ask, what is a public intellectual? Only in the US, do you want to get on NBC, MSNBC, or on Fox? How about the act of self-confrontation? Socrates says we are never alone. We're always in our own company. And I think, particularly, and you may know this better than I do because I'm a technological idiot and quite happily. So I'm a self-proclaimed Luddite. I write by hand, I make my notes by hand, I insist on the book, and I am truly old-fashioned, right? But I wonder if in this world where everything is about self-presentation and self-promotion, I wonder if we ever ask, what's the cost of that? What is it? Are we afraid of being alone? I don't mean to sound like some pop psychologist, but how about trying to think about being in your own company or being able to think because you are in your own company? Writing is the most brutal act of self-confrontation. And I recommend it instead of going on TikTok. But hey, what do I know? I'm not
Yeah.
on.
Well, let me just add parenthetically to connect what was said about Japan and Heidegger, that interest in Heidegger immediately started back in the late 20s when Being in Time was published. And it's not well known, but there were, I think, 7 different translations of this massive book, Being in Time, before there was even one in English. So we were late to the game, the Japanese knew immediately that anybody who picks up on a poet the quality of Holderlin and philosophizes from that in the mode of thinking, which is openness, that's what we want. So the attraction was enormous. And the fact that any Zen master worth his salt is also a poet. That to
Yes,
be able
yes,
to say what you have to say in 4 lines, short lines,
yeah,
is the highest achievement.
yeah. It's that ability to crystallize and distill, right? It's what makes of Gerard Manley Hopkins such a
Mm.
singular poet,
Yeah.
right?
On one hand, it seems to me thinking is really an ability to listen deeply, to listen and be able to hear ourselves thinking in a
Yeah.
meditative kind of way. And it's a way of being. It's a way of being that is not instrumental, you could say. So that's
Yes.
why poetry is such a close cousin because poets leave things out and they don't try to explain. But Professor Farad, to switch tacks a little bit, I have a major grievance, which is when you were observing surroundings, you astutely pointed out the books and you pointed out the bicycle, but you did not point out the serious Japanese whiskey collection right over
Well,
my shoulder. Now, how can
well, you know what that is about. That's my own abstemious, because I'm sure Professor Wright has stories about this. But when I was invited to Japan, because they're an incredibly polite people, right? They asked me, so, we're going to do all these things, take you to Kabuki Theater, which I only got through two-thirds of because God, it goes on. And I don't like eating at the theater, but maybe that may just be me. But I went to the Japanese Baseball Hall of Fame. I went to see a game between the Giants and somebody else. It was great. But uh, one of the invitational questions was, so what would you prefer? To go to a beer garden or a whiskey bar? And I'm so glad they asked the question because I've never consumed alcohol in my life. So I know that if I had been there, and that was the first confrontation, I would have offended them. But they were polite enough to sort of, they got a heads up. I think they were slightly taken aback and didn't believe me. But that's generally, people think I mean, as you can see, you've talked to me for an hour. I don't need alcohol or chemicals to get high. I read Was heißt denken and then I'm good to go. And, the other thing about poetry, it's not just the pairing and the leaving out, but it's also an invitation. It's an invitation to think with. What can you make of this? That's a sort of creative notion. And I think both you and Professor Wright have pointed to this, right? Zen masters are not only poets, but they're creators of modes of living.
oh, and there are many incredible Zen poets. Can I get back to this grievance?
Sure.
I'm cognizant of our time, but it's so unfair to you, but I did want to allude to your latest manuscript or latest publication, Grievance and Fragments, and I'm halfway through, but it's written in the aphoristic style, which is for our fire philosophy readers, we're very familiar with because Dale writes his own aphorisms that he shares with our readers. And it's, as you know, there's something special that happens in this particular style. And the first fragment, the first aphorism you offer in this book says, grievance is more American than apple pie. Can you condense the rest of your brilliant manuscript
I
in the question of how to live? How do you fit this American piness of grievance? Like, is that a way to live? Or, like,
no. Yeah, I mean the final line I think of grievance in fragments is, how are we? It's a question, how are we to be in the world? And I mean, I wrote, it's one of those, I'm sure you've had these experiences, but folks, a publishing house asked me, they commissioned the work, and I said, I've got this thing that I'm considering on grievance. I sent it to them and they said, no, this is not what we want. I did, as it's now evident, find a publisher. But I think I remarked maybe 20 minutes or half an hour ago on something like, only writing can bear truth. And I am drawn increasingly now to shorter aphoristic forms, or in a phrase, a more experimental mode of writing, because I'm interested in how one can raise difficult issues, how one can present questions in such a way that disarticulates our own expectations. I think the monograph is a remarkable thing and a necessary mode of writing. But I'm also interested now in sort of asking a question, working with the difficulty, and then like a dog with a bone, not letting it go. Just kind of circling it, coming back to it, trying to find as many ways as I can to ask this question, to live with this difficulty. The project is, as far as possible, yes, to offer a series of possible, shall we say, effects, but more importantly, to live with the richness of the difficulty. And you're halfway through, so you'll know that, there are mentions of, scholars, Wendy Brown, among others. I think there's also a fairly sustained engagement with Toni Morrison's beloved. But I also quote Bob Dylan and, Robbie Robertson and the band. So I'm trying to draw on a series of what is to hand, a series of objects, phrases, difficulties that are to hand to help us think about this. And what is, for me, at the core of the difficulty that is grievance, as you said, colon in fragments, is a determination to distinguish between grief and grievance. And it comes back in some ways to both the questions both of you, or contributions both of you have offered, which is grievance knows itself. It knows how to act. January the 6th is also the Feast of the Epiphany, though, insights seem to have been in short supply in that moment, and America, it seems to me, has blinded itself to what that meant. But grievance knows itself. It's sure of itself. It cannot abide uncertainty. Whereas grief is a call to live with. Grief is the price we pay for love. Right? That's one way to pose it. But grief is not just loss. It is learning to live with loss. It is learning to come to terms with the love that is lodged at the core of that loss. And it is about an openness to not knowing. Grief does not have a timetable. Grief is not specific. It's not to say that it's without its own historicity. It is rather learning to live after, but understanding that learning to live after has a very particular antecedent that remains within us. It's not just a trace of the other, but it is the ways in which the other has helped us to be in the world. Why? Because of the other, certain modes of engagement, openness, of poiesis, of self-making is possible. So in this way, grief is both poiesis and sympoiesis, and making with, right? Yeah. Again, we're in Heidegger country, right? Mitsein, being with. That's what grief is. It's a being with that is mediated through love, that tries to account for that loss, but must acknowledge that it cannot fully account for what it means to be without the other, but also to acknowledge the other's ongoing presence. It's the being with that is to hand and yet is indiscernible. It is, in short, to follow both Socrates and Derrida, learning to live in order to know not so much what it means to die, but to know what the other's death, how the other's death registers in us. Because this is what Socrates is preparing people for at the end of the Phaedrus, right? He says, the women should go, I've cleaned myself, I've been bathed, I'm ready. And the men start to weep, and Socrates, in his most sort of, today we call it misogyny, but he says to the men, I sent out the women so you wouldn't have to cry. Why are you crying? Can we live with loss? How are we to live with that loss? Because we know from Socrates that we must live with loss, that we will live with loss, that all life is marked by that loss. If one is of a certain monotheistic persuasion, then we talk about in the language or the discourse of the lapsarian. So the loss is everywhere. But the loss must not be allowed to, I don't know, to render us unable to be in the world. In fact, in many ways, grief is what enriches our being in the world. It intensifies our relationship to the other. It makes certain recollections possible. It is an autopoiesis. It is a self-making in the wake of the others having left, but without being gone.
That was really excellent and a good place to close. Great. Many thanks to you, Professor Furrier, for joining us. Perhaps again someday.
I would be most honored, Professor Wright. Thank you for indulging me. I am very appreciative of that. Professor Pirokowski, now and then the world throws up a student, and then the student comes back to you in a form entirely unanticipated. And then you are left as teacher with an immense humility, because you say, how could that have been possible? And then there it is before you. And then all those moments, they derive some meaning, and a meaning that is never insignificant, but the joy is in the surprise. And then you find yourself engaged by a student and put on the spot, and you say, today the world's all right.